Okay, so what is your name and what occupation and war did you work in?
Okay, so Nathan Lewis, I was a captain in the United States Marine Corps. I was an O204, so I was an intelligence officer, but my specialty was counterintelligence, human intelligence.
Okay.
So I was in Operation Iraqi Freedom. There were different versions, so I went twice. So I was in 2006, I was in Iraq, and in 2007, I was in Iraq.
Why did you choose to be an interrogator of prisoners of war in Iraq?
Well, the way the military works is, I guess on the officer side is, first you get ranked in order of your performance on a number of things. So leadership traits, physical fitness, aptitude testing, whole list, as well as peer review. So other officers would give their ranking of how you performed. And based on that, I was actually fourth out of 268 other officers that were going through the training. After the Marine Corps, my plan was to go work in either the Central Intelligence Agency or the FBI. So I was really hoping to get some sort of intelligence slot, and counterintelligence, human intelligence was really kind of the sought-after position. The Marine Corps only has maybe 2 to 4 officers at that time put through that course in a year. And I thought, well, that would really make me stand out from the other candidates. And I thought, based on feedback I'd gotten from other officers, they thought I'd be really good at it. And so, yeah, I put in and I was given that occupational specialty.
Do you know what your peers thought set you apart from other officers, where you were top ranked, and what gave you that edge to get that position?
Just, I worked really hard. So infantry officer training is that's a tough process regardless, but I was married at the time, so I lived off of the base. But I would come in at about 4 a.m. every day. And so I was usually on base, usually around 3 hours before anybody would even wake up. And I would do all of my studies between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m. before anybody woke up. So I was very well prepared. I worked really hard. So I think a lot of officers saw how dedicated I was to that. My physical fitness, too, I was in great shape. And I have a couple of stories that also maybe kind of set me apart. So we have a marksmanship competition. So every Marine officer has to qualify on both the rifle and the pistol. And that's a pretty standard process. And I got expert in both, which is what you want to get. It's the top level of marksmanship. But then after that, it was called the Iron Mike Challenge. And it was a marksmanship competition where targets pop up from anywhere from 50 meters all the way out to like 400 meters, but you don't know the distance. And I was just feeling very confident that day, and I was jokingly going around to all the other officers telling them that, I'm going to win this, I'm going to win this. And the competition started, and my first shot was, I estimated, probably 400 meters away, and I took the shot, and the target went down on the first shot. And I thought, whoa, my rifle's on, everything's working really well, and I ended up winning the competition. So the fact that I kind of called it was something that I think a lot of people thought was special. So I think there was a lot of things where people saw my dedication to getting on base early. They saw my physical fitness, and obviously the story of me making my wife puke was pretty legendary. And then the confidence / cockiness and aggressiveness I showed with some of our marksmanship. And I was very aggressive tactically as well. In our field exercises, I was never afraid to make a decision. I would make very decisive decisions and really go after the training.
Okay. What was your everyday life like over in Iraq?
So because my primary responsibility is providing administrative support to my Marines that were also in that battle space, I woke up every day at 6 a.m., and I would usually do some physical fitness to stay in shape. And then I would start off by reading all of the intelligence reporting that my team produced the day before. and that would take a long time. So my team developed, it was over 1,000 intelligence reports in a 7-month period. So there's a lot of, and that's just one type of report that we're doing. So that was a big part of my day. And then I had different types of meetings that I would go to. And then we had what we called I guess it was the Intel and Operations meeting. And we had that, usually it was around dinner time that we would meet, and then we would be planning any type of targets for that night. We'd be planning any big operations. So that was a very typical day. Usually at around 9 o'clock, all of my work was done, and then that's when I would go down and I would start interrogating detainees. So if we did, typically the night before, if we did any raids that resulted in detainees, which I would say on average we would get about 3 to 5 detainees every day. We would bring them back to where I was, and then me and my gunnery sergeant, who is my chief, we would go down and we would do interrogations throughout the night. And so I would usually end my interrogations usually around 1 or 2 a.m., and then I would go to sleep and start it all over again.
And do you remember what your first days were like overseas, and what do you remember most about them?
Man, I remember not a lot of sleep. And I would say my first 30 days, what I remember is it seemed like my first of everything was the worst it could have been. So the helicopter ride that I took, apparently we got shot at in the helicopter ride. I just know the helicopter started doing evasive maneuvers, and I really didn't know what was going on. So that was the worst experience I had. My first convoy that I went on, an IED hit our lead vehicle. My first combat patrol I went on, a sniper took a shot at the squad, the patrol that I was in. It went over, I heard the snap over my head. And I'm trying to think of, so it was like all of the first things I did, actually, what I was very lucky is that ended up being the worst experience. So I was very lucky with my experience. My first 30 days were kind of the roughest part of that.
Have any stories that you found interesting, or like besides the getting shot out in the plane, like any odd stories?
Probably just more, make fun of myself type stories. So I remember one night, it was one of the first, in fact, I think it was the night I got to Haditha Dam. And I remember I was at the very bottom of the dam, and we had 81 millimeter mortar section close by, and they were firing off some 81 millimeter mortars, just doing like illumination, type rounds. But when those things go off, they sound like an explosion. And so I remember it was the first time I'd ever heard an 81 millimeter mortar, and so it goes off, and I immediately just, went to the ground. And of course everybody's laughing because they know that those are outgoing rounds, not incoming rounds. So that's one, story. Probably the closest I ever came to death was actually going for a run a few times. One of my runs, this was when I was, my second tour, when I was on an air base. I was at Al-Assad Air Base. That's getting some press because of ISIS and their control of the western Al-Anbar province. But I just happened to see a slightly different color of the dirt right in front of me. And like within a second I realized that's a snake. And I jumped. And as I jumped, the snake struck where I was coming from. I was like vertical at that time, so it didn't get me. But it was definitely a viper snake. It had the arrowhead on it, and it was humorous enough. Like that's the closest that I came to death, which is just funny to think about. Out of all the things that I did, a snake was the thing that almost would have taken me out of action. Seeing my Marines come home, and those with small children, I don't know how they do it, but they do such a great job. But just seeing the family, rush and hug each other, and that's a great feeling and a great thing to see. I was very lucky; all of my Marines came home safe, both tours, and so that's a great feeling to have, to not have to experience that loss.
And then last question, was there anything hard about transitioning back to America in between tours, or the mindset of having to go back on a tour.
Yeah, I think that's just the mentality of you're doing something so intensely that it's hard just to turn it off. But eventually, you know, it goes down. And now, like recently, I watched a documentary on Iraq, and it was a documentary kind of going through the whole Iraq war, and then now with ISIS there. And that night, you know, I had a nightmare where I was yelling or doing something, and my wife, you know, was like, "Yeah, you're being crazy." You know, again, last night we were trying to figure out why, and I was like, "I watched that documentary." So I think there's probably still some things that linger, but nothing that I feel like was long term. That's for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sitting down with me.
Yeah.